All right, well, thank you so much. Thank you for being here. It's, I think, particularly gratifying to talk here as is sort of like talking to family, talking to a lot of the people who were with me as I was writing this book and suffering through my lectures after sleepless nights, etc., and giving me encouragement and feedback about what I was up to. So anyway, it's great to be here. Thank you for being here. I should mention that I had shoulder surgery on Friday, so that's the reason for the hideous and distracting, visually distracting getup that I'm wearing, outfit that I'm wearing. So hopefully not too distracting. So I went and wrote a book with a theologian named Bill Dyrness, and so it was conceived from the beginning as a collaborative project between someone involved in the visual arts who's theologically minded and theoretically minded, with a theologian who's artistically minded and interested in the arts. And that means that it was a project of trying to see eye to eye, sometimes, or trying to generate a conversation between two disciplines that have been fairly divorced for a number of decades. Bill reaching from the discipline of theology, me reaching from the discipline of art criticism, and trying to meet up and read artworks and read texts together and write together. And so I just want to talk through the book a little bit today, and then hopefully wrap up with some time for questions and discussion and so forth. So just a bit about the book to kind of set the context. What is this book trying to do? What context does it appear in? The first is that the book is positioned in relation to art history, the discipline of art history, namely modernist and contemporary, not so much contemporary, modernist art history. And that is a fraught context. As one example of some writing about the fraught condition of modern art history is a book from about 12 years ago by a guy named James Elkins, an art historian from the Art Institute of Chicago, who wrote a book called On the Strange Place of Religion in Contemporary Art. And essentially, Elkins' book is about the impossibility of talking about religion in the discourse of contemporary art. So he says things something like this: contemporary art, I think, is as far from organized religion as Western art has ever been, and that may be its most singular achievement or its cardinal failure, depending on your point of view. The separation has become entrenched. Aside from the rare exceptions, religion is seldom mentioned in the art world unless it's linked to criticism, ironic distance, or scandal. And he's not, the book is really trying to be descriptive rather than prescriptive. He's not trying to tell us how it should be, but just how things have been. And you might not have much of a view of it here at Biola, because I think we try to get these things together more than usual. But if you do a lot of reading in modern art history and do a lot of advanced studies in modern art history, you will know that it just, modern art and religion, whatever that's referring to, usually it's Christianity, modern art and religion just don't have much to do with each other than as antagonists, sort of mutual antagonists. That's a very common sort of narrative. And Elkins is noting that and complaining, I think, that it leaves something out of the ways that we write art history, particularly modernist art history. He goes on and concludes, actually this isn't the conclusion, this is still toward the beginning of the book. Art that sets out to convey spiritual values goes against the grain of the history of modernism. To suddenly put modern art back with religion or spirituality is to give up the history and purposes of a certain understanding of modernism. For Elkins, the reason that we can't talk sensibly about contemporary art and religion is because of modernism, as he puts it. There's a certain grain of the history of modernism that disallows the resources for thinking theologically about artworks, modern artworks. I like Elkins' books, and particularly this one. A lot of Christians, I think, received this with they received it defensively. I think he's actually mostly right, and basically his argument is just, when we get to interpreting modern artworks, religion and theology just drops out of the picture. We don't know how to interpret it, even if it's there, in the ways that we've set up modern art history, because of the ways that we understand what modernism is. Okay, if that doesn't make any sense, hold on. Hopefully it will in a minute. And he'll appeal, I suppose I might as well drop this in. He'll appeal to a number of art historians and critics, including a very famous art historian named Rosalind Krauss, who in the 70s, which will be an important date here in just 1 minute, would write something like this: in the increasingly desacralized space of the 19th century, namely the beginning of modern art, art had become the refuge for religious emotion. It became, as it has remained, a secular form of belief. Although this condition could be discussed openly in the late 19th century, it's something that is inadmissible in the 20th, so that by now we find it indescribably embarrassing to mention art and spirit in the same sentence. And I think that does name a certain kind of ethos to the way modernist art history is written and criticism is written. So on the one hand, our book is positioned in that context, saying, look, the ways we've constructed our narratives of modern art history and the kind of methods of modern art criticism is leaving out a lot that is very relevant to interpreting the works. It turns out that modern artists, a lot of them, were deeply interested in religion. Most of them were raised in fairly devout religious homes, and they were wrestling with it. But when you get to the writing about their works, that stuff just drops out of the picture. And so in that context, we're saying, well, actually, we might need to rethink the role of the religious contexts of modern art and the theological concerns running through it in order to do good history about it, to do good criticism of the works. So that's one of the contexts that we're writing in. Secondly, we're also responding to and appear in the context of writers, artists, historians, and so forth, who are Christians writing about modern art. That over the last few decades, there has been a sort of swell of religious people, particularly Christians, writing about modern art and seeing if they can kind of understand the relationship between modern art and theology, modern art and religion. Perhaps one of the most famous of those books is a book called Modern Art and the Death of a Culture by Hans Rookmaaker. Rookmaaker was a good friend of Francis Schaeffer's, if you have familiarity with Schaeffer. And he kind of came on the scene and was writing about modern art and Christianity at a time when there just was not much of anyone doing that, writing about that. And it was very exciting. He got a huge groundswell of people interested in what he was saying about modern art. And he did all these lectures, a kind of lecture tour through North America, some in Britain, and compiled those lectures into this book called Modern Art and the Death of a Culture. And you can see from our title, we're positioning our book directly in relation to Rookmaaker's book. But you can also tell from the title, questioning the way that he went about things. So you can kind of tell from the title, it's a little bit of I'm slightly misleading you about the title, but you can kind of get a sense, at least from the title, that Modern Art and the Death of a Culture implies that he doesn't have a very positive view of modern art. And indeed, he doesn't. His view of modern art is very, very dark, I think. So he'll write things like this in this book. One thing binds all these modernist groups together and arts together: the assertion that reality is at stake, that it has become a question mark, that it seems to be something man cannot be happy with, something that is strange to him. Crisis, alienation, absurdity, it's words like these which describe the artistic situation. And it's words like those that describe his interpretation of modern art and the general trajectory of modern art. So he tracks modern art through a series of 3 steps in which things are gradually sort of unraveling into a kind of increasing absurdity and nihilism. And he's coming on the scene and saying modern art is theologically loaded. It is. We do have to account for the religious background, the theological content of it, but he reads that background as very strained and that content as deeply worrying. He'll go on to say the issues at stake in modern art are not just cultural and intellectual, but spiritual. What's involved is a whole way of thinking that leaves out of account and so largely negates vital aspects of our humanity and our understanding of reality. And there you get a kind of sense of how he interprets artworks. He does think that whole way of thinking, in modern art is linked to not just what artists are depicting, but how they're depicting it, how they're handling subjects. And he sees in modern art a lot of fragmentation, a lot of fracturing, a lot of discontinuity, and he is reading that as implying fracturing, discontinuity, rupture in the whole way of thinking about reality. And he's worried that modern art is fundamentally dehumanizing, not taking into account and negating parts of our humanity. It's dehumanizing and it's disorienting our understandings of reality, or reflecting a disoriented understanding of reality. So if on the one hand we're saying, well, modern art history doesn't have a very compelling take on the role of religion and theology in the formation of modern art and modern art history. If we're saying that on the one hand, on the other hand, we're saying, but when Christians get involved in trying to reread it, we get really dark and really defensive really quickly. And that has been somewhat unhelpful, fairly unhelpful, to having meaningful conversation. Ironically, both camps are reliant on a deeply, a view that Western culture has deeply secularized. They are both reliant on a pretty rigorous secularization theory. They just disagree about the sort of meaning of the secularization, or the implications of it, or the goodness of it. So we're trying to position our book in relation to both and trying to be a corrective to both. That's a fool's errand. It means we'll get attacked by everyone, I think, and make no one happy. Oh well, you can do such things when you're young and full of vim and vigor. I'm not feeling very full of vim and vigor lately, but when I wrote the book, I was. So that's first. One more context that I'll put this in, and then we'll get on with it. By the way, this sort of context building that I'm doing here is part one of the book, sort of situating it in art historical context and in relation to Rookmaaker especially, kind of providing critiques or positioning the book in relation to each. One more context that's worth bringing into view is that I mentioned that both of these views, both Elkin's view and Rookmaaker's view, rely on a secularization theory. What secularization theory is the idea that as a society modernizes, it secularizes. That modernization just implies and demands a secularization. And over the last 2 decades especially, secularization theory has been deeply called into question. Very few people hold to it, academics hold to it anymore. It has become very problematic. One of the reasons for that is that it appears that our world is actually desecularizing. Just historically, sociologically, the world is not getting less religious, it's getting more religious. So the central tenets of secularization theory need some correction, because secularization theory in the 50s and 60s held that religion will be totally dead by the 21st century. That doesn't seem to be happening. And a lot of academics are starting to talk about this era we're in as a post-secular age. That secularization means something, but we seem to be coming out the other side into something else, post-secular. We do that in academics. In academia, we just say, put a post on the front and we're on to the next thing. And a number of scholars have also been studying what they're referring to as the return of religion in the 21st century especially. A return of religion not just to popular culture, but a return of religion to academic culture, scholarship, that of all places happened sort of most aggressively and prominently in the postmodernist, post-structuralist French thinkers. That's where the return of religion really got a lot of traction. So, secularity is totally crucial. Defining secularity is just totally crucial to our project. And for that, we turn to a fantastic but way too long book by Charles Taylor called A Secular Age. And we won't go into Taylor too much, but just to pull out one idea from Taylor that's important to our book. Taylor says, okay, we need to rethink what we mean by secularity. We are actually talking about 3 different things, usually, when we're referring to secularity. On the one hand, and he calls this secularity 1, we have a privatization of religious belief, a separation between sacred and secular. The secular is public, the sacred becomes private. You just do your own kind of private thing. So secularity can mean that. Secondly, secularity, we often refer to secularity as a rejection of religious belief, a decline in a culture or in people of religious belief, of theology or whatever, religious practice. And we often refer to secularity in those terms as some sort of rejection or decay. But Taylor argues there's a third definition to secularity, and it appears to be the one that is most accurate to what has happened over the last few decades, several decades, and that he refers to as a fragilization of belief and practice. That what he argues is that in a secular age, what we get is not the decline of religion or even the privatization of religion. We get those things, but not primarily as the sort of dominant ethos. Rather, we get a fragilization of belief and practice. That you can only hold your beliefs today, religious or otherwise, in the context of numerous other options. So you can no longer just hold your belief sort of axiomatically is what he calls it. I need a better word for that. normatively. You can't just grow up a Christian and just stay a Christian without that being tested by all of the other better options that are on the table. Better. As Taylor says, Taylor, by the way, is a Catholic philosopher. Taylor says, one can't hold his or her beliefs today without looking over their shoulder. And that's right. That's a fragilization of belief. One of the kind of premises of our book is that we're arguing that the way, yes, modern art is profoundly secular, but that has been assumed, the assumption has been that it's profoundly secular in terms of secularity too. Modern art just represents a revolt against the church, a revolt against tradition, and so forth. A rejection of religious belief, or maybe a privatization in the sense that it's just, whatever you believe, that just don't make it public. But we're arguing that actually modern art is profoundly secular, but in terms of the third. Modern art is the art of fragile belief, contested belief, people struggling with what they believe and what to believe. And if we put it in that context, modern art begins making loads of sense in the ways that it is wrestling with religious traditions and theological ideas. And that is just a modernity, is a kind of, represents a cultural scrambling of theological concepts, religious traditions, and it creates this sort of pressurized space where one holds a faith only by wrestling with it, and it becomes a fragile thing, I suppose. Okay, is that okay? Is that all right? Enough framework building, maybe? If you want more of that, part one of the book is awesome. Part two of the book then goes into the histories and says, okay, fine, this is good. We've been doing theorizing, like reframing this, rethinking how our assumptions behind modern art history. But we need to deal with the actual history. And we do that in a number of ways, a series of chapters that are divided up geographically. So a chapter on French modernism, French and British, German and Northern European modernism, Russian modernism, North American, and so on. And we decided to, in a lot of ways, it would have been a really exciting project to take, to kind of reweave the canon, the art history canon. But we decided for this project, let's take the classics. Like, let's take those artists and artworks that everyone has written tons about, and let's reread those. Let's go for it. Let's make this contestable, highly contestable. So we do that, and we decided to take Rookmaaker's same time frame. So he reads modernism as 1800 to 1970 when he publishes the book. So we take that same time frame for our book, and pick out a few artists, a handful of artists. I think, so there are too many artists for me to talk about here. Maybe I'll point to a couple of them as teasers and then focus on one, give you a little bit of a focus, and then we'll take some questions and whatnot. Such a book would be incomplete if we didn't include Vincent van Gogh, who was a profound theological thinker. He was a really interesting theologian and was trained as a theologian. He went to seminary for a period of time. That went okay, not so well, actually. And he leaves seminary and leaves the ministry. He wanted to be a pastor. He was training to be a pastor. Leaves it really disoriented, fragilized in a lot of ways, and turned to painting. And the paintings are just all the way through working through theology. They just are. The whole thing is theological, I think, I would argue. And it's a strained theology. This is him painting the last remnants of a Catholic cathedral in the town where he was living with his parents. His dad had just passed away and was buried in a nearby cemetery here at this site. And this is and it's a cemetery because people had been buried in the church for years and years, and the church gets torn down. It's in total disrepair. The only thing remaining of it is this dilapidated bell tower that no longer has its steeple. This is an image for Van Gogh and for the rest of us of a dying Christianity, a dying church. And he thought about it in those terms. One that was sitting amidst fields of dead bodies, and the bell tower as this kind of hope. It is a symbol of the Christian hope that the bells are supposed to ring and call people in with a hope of the resurrection. And here it sits, this dilapidated thing, in this field of dead people. It is a giant question mark. It is a sort of specter that haunts a lot of his paintings from this period. He just obsessively paints this bell tower, probably 15 paintings devoted to this thing. And throughout his work, he's doing, even the most famous paintings, he's doing theology and questioning, how does one believe in God when it's hard to believe in the church? That's, I think, gets close to his questions. In a painting like this, you have a town of Saint-Remy with a church in the middle, with a long steeple. The town is a Catholic church. That's not a Catholic church. Van Gogh swapped out the church that was there. The church that was there had a dome. It was a domed Catholic church. And he puts in a Protestant church, the church he was raised in. It is a darkened church pointing up into the heavens. Its shape is mirrored by this cypress tree that is Van Gogh referred to in one of his letters as funereal. Funeral. It's a funeral tree. It's a symbol of death. And he looks out on these two pointers, these two things pointing into the heavens, and he sees something else in the heavens that you'll have to read the book to. No. He sees a world testifying to the presence of love. He refers to love as a circle that encircles all things and shines through all things. And his paintings, I think, are very much devoted to wrestling with that. He also famously has a friendship rivalry with Paul Gauguin, who trained as a Catholic seminarian. He was training as a priest before becoming disenchanted and sort of running off and becoming a painter. It's a typical story, actually. That story happens over and over again. People leaving seminary to become painters. Fortunately, you've already, well, no. And Gauguin is painting a kind of his view of transcendence or sacredness, the pious people of Breton having a religious vision of Jacob wrestling with the angel after a sermon. And Van Gogh replies to Gauguin in words, but also in painting, and says, "You've got your theology wrong." And he makes this painting, The Sower with the Setting Sun, and as a direct response to this, borrowing the tree and saying, "Gauguin, you've set things up so that there's this mysterious vision, the beyond, that you're not sure if it's there, you're not sure if it's internal to these people, or if it's really there, you're uncertain." The theology of the incarnation turns that on its head. So the vision of the sacred is on our side of the tree, in the form of this sower walking toward us, sowing seeds. Van Gogh preached a number of sermons when he was a pastor about the parable of the sower, parable of the soils, and repeats these sower paintings a few times. I think meditating on the ways that we think about the sacred as transcendent versus immanent. And Van Gogh totally sides with the immanent side of that equation. And so if for Gauguin, there's a kind of spatial, a transcendent gap that happened, that tree marks, that is a somewhere else, a something else. For Gauguin, or for Van Gogh, it becomes a kind of eschatological distance. He always puts the home of the farmer in the background, in the distance. The other side is a sometime else, not a somewhere else, I guess we could say. Okay, that's supposed to be just a teaser about Van Gogh. I'm not going to talk about Van Gogh. We talk about a number of artists in the book. Pierre Mondrian is a fascinating artist, often discussed in terms of the move toward abstraction as a kind of pure formalism. Mondrian was preoccupied with, he gets to these paintings by painting facades of the church and the ocean. And he talked about them as, these are the symbols of the immutable. These are the closest things I witnessed to the immutable, the eternal. And abstraction was for him a kind of, I think, a visual theological exercise. Kandinsky is fascinating. I think I learned so much about Kandinsky from researching this book. He's a fascinating writer and painter, also often talked about as the kind of father of abstraction, which is right in a lot of ways. So he painted this massive painting. It's like 6 by 10 feet, this huge manifesto of abstract painting, I guess. But if you go back and read him and look at this work in context, over and over again, he is painting the apocalypse, the resurrection of the dead, and the last judgment. He felt that painting must be abstract. It should no longer look like, devote itself to observing how things look. But that doesn't mean that it starts from nowhere or starts from pure materiality. It has to start from one's deepest yearnings or fears or loves. And for him, evidently, the book of Revelation tuned a lot of those things. So in this time period, he was just making loads of resurrection paintings, Last Judgment paintings. And if you see this kind of massive manifesto to abstraction, it's the same structure. You have the angels blowing their trumpets, the kind of apocalyptic moment. The city of Babylon on the hill with its crumbling towers, the people raising from the dead. It's the same painting in a lot of ways. And it corresponds with the release of a book that he released with this painting called On the Spiritual in Art, in which he was trying to provide a written kind of thesis, I guess, to stand next to the painted thesis, if that's not too awkward a way of putting it. So Kandinsky, these are just supposed to be teasers, and I'm taking too long. We talk about Russian modernism, and I'm talking primarily about the stuff that I wrote, not what Bill wrote. we divided the chapters, so. Russian modernism, Natalia Goncharova is fascinating. I won't talk anything more about her right now. There's I think a really interesting section on Kazimir Malevich, who is often interpreted as a nihilist, and I just don't think so. And I think I mount a pretty good argument against interpreting him as a nihilist. He was an apophatic theologian. He was deeply concerned with the nothingness. But for him, it's not nothingness, it's no-thingness. It's the one beyond thought, beyond vision. So he was making these vacant icons that he put in the corners of the room, just like where the Orthodox icon would go in the red corner. But he was thinking about them as apophatic icons, the image of the imageless. And I think I make that argument pretty well in the book. toward the end of his life, or later on, he writes a book called God Is Not Cast Down, Art, Church, and Factory. And it's roughly about that time that he turns to making all these paintings of crosses and mystics, and returns to figuration. And in fact, returns to, I think, making icons. The figure comes back. And he's borrowing traditional iconography and certainly changing it, and that makes a lot of religious people, particularly Orthodox people for whom these icons are very sacred, nervous about this. But it's not correct to assume that he was doing so flippantly or nihilistically, as is often, I think, interpreted. We do cover North American art. There's, I think, a fascinating passage on Alan Capro and John Cage, Robert Rauschenberg, artists who were all, except for Capro, raised in religious households, and I think continued wrestling with it throughout their lives in one way or another. This is really, I think I wrote a really interesting thing on John Cage. For those of you who are interested in music, I think it's good, and I haven't read anything quite like it. So I hope it's a contribution. I don't know. I'm sure I'll get skewered for it, but and Warhol. I think the portion on Warhol is a real contribution, if I can say so. Arguing about the I think theology of Warhol, who after he died, it emerged, a bunch of people were saying, oh yeah, he was a deeply religious man, and none of us knew what to do with it. He went to Mass weekly, sometimes daily, and was just a religious man, and however you understand that, I think as a secular religious man, someone for whom one's belief and practices is deeply fragilized and compromised specifically by mass media, the proliferation of religious images that empty out the meaning of religious images. So how do you kind of maintain a religious visual culture if the images are emptied out? We also talk a bit about Ed Ruscha, for those of you who are interested in pop art, who also was a Catholic. But I'll talk in a little bit more depth about another place that is probably most controversial in the book, or at least most surprising. We have a pretty good portion devoted to Hugo Ball and Dada, Zurich Dada. So I want to talk just a bit about Dada, and then we'll stop and take some questions. Is that okay? Are you guys hanging in there? Do you want to hear about Dada? I chose to talk about him because I've been having lots of conversations with people around here recently about Dada, and so might as well. So within the reasons this is probably most surprising, and I think one of the big contributions in the book, or of the book, is that Dada is often represented as the epicenter of nihilism in modern art. I mean, if you need any more classic case of absurdity and meaninglessness and alienation, look to Dada. And that is certainly how Rookmaaker described Dada. And with good reason. There were a lot of nihilists who were Dadaists. But I think it turns out that Dada had a lot more going on theologically in it than just nihilism and anti-rationalism and so forth. Although you can be anti-rationalist and still devout. Maybe that's what I'm arguing here. Let's see. Hugo Ball, by all accounts, stands at the fountainhead of Dada. He launched the Dada movement at the Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich in 1916, February of 1916, and organized a small group of people, all of whom were fleeing World War I to the neutral Switzerland, Zurich, Switzerland. And they launched Cabaret Voltaire as a revolt against the society that was waging war on itself. Ball was raised a devout Catholic and went to university and became deeply interested in anarchism and Nietzsche, as one does. One becomes kind of a Nietzschean anarchist. In fact, he was doing his PhD on Nietzsche until he decided that he needed to devote himself to art and to the theater specifically, and so he left his PhD program before finishing his PhD, his dissertation on Nietzsche. Though it's partially written, and we have it, and it's quite interesting, quite interesting discourse on Nietzsche. So he leaves and forms the Dada movement through a variety of kind of trails. And Dada he's involved with Dada for about a year and a half. So launches it, becomes somewhat disenchanted with it, and leaves, and converts back to Catholicism, and devotes himself to an ascetic, like monkish lifestyle for the rest of his life. He didn't live very much longer after he converts, maybe 7 years, because he lived such an ascetic lifestyle that he became sort of malnourished and sick. With his wife, Emmy Hennings, who also was a devout Catholic, I think throughout that period. And devotes himself to ascetic lifestyle as well as writing about the Christian mystics. He publishes this book called Byzantine Christianity about Dionysius the Areopagite and John Climacus and so forth. Fascinating guy. And he publishes during that time his diary from the Dada years, which is called Flight Out of Time. And there's lots of argument about the diaries because people argued that he redacted them to give more of a kind of push toward Catholicism, more religion in them than there would have been. It's a strange argument because he did convert back to Catholicism, so it's hard to argue that, well, he edited it to make it look like he was going back to Catholicism, right? Anyway, if you read the journals, what emerges is someone who's wrestling with essentially theological ideas all the way through Dada. And I'll give you just a bit of a kind of introduction to Dada and to Hugo Ball. Ball describes Dada, the Dada movement, Cabaret Voltaire, as a gesture. This is his word. Every word that's spoken and sung here at least says this one thing, that this humiliating age has not succeeded in winning our respect. Mountains are being displaced and cities lifted up in the air, so why shouldn't the plaster around human hearts get splits and cracks in it? Cabaret Voltaire and the Dada movement was about opening those splits and cracks. If those of you who know much about it, it was a typical soiree or performance in the cabaret was just wild and cacophonous, nonsense, a lot of nonsense, or seemingly nonsense. People reciting poems at the same time with someone in the back banging on the piano and various things going on. They're just cacophonous, really disruptive events. But for Ball, he was talking about those things as a revolt against the world of World War I, the world that he saw of rationality, rationalism, economy, and sort of capitalist economy, and Enlightenment thinking in general, all converging and becoming wildly self-destructive. So how do you revolt against that? You oppose rationalism with nonsense, supposedly, and you object to the concentration of wealth and exploitation of people through, I suppose, buffoonery, is what he would say. In fact, he describes the Cabaret Voltaire in overtly theological terms during this time. In perhaps his most famously concise statement, he says, "What we are celebrating here is both buffoonery and a requiem mass for his society, for his people." He compares Dada to a Gnostic sect whose initiates were so stunned by the image of the childhood of Jesus that they lay down in the cradle and let themselves be suckled by women and swaddled. The Dadaists are similar babes in arms in a new age. And if you look at the Dada performances, there's a lot of theology in them and religion. They did in June of 1916, they did a nativity play that is a typically Dadaist, I guess, cacophony, but not a cacophony. The final scene kind of builds toward this crucifixion, in which there's this uproar of characters yelling, animals bellowing and mooing, people jeering, there's wailing. And then it gives way to what he describes as nailing and screaming, then thunders, then bells. And most likely the last words spoken in the play were handwritten into the otherwise typed script. It says, "As he was crucified, much warm blood was shed." He's mapping the birth and crucifixion of Christ onto World War I. And it was reflecting on this kind of event as meditating on the human violence that has bloodied and soiled the good God. And he describes the event as afterwards, everyone was silent in the room. And in his words, we welcomed the child in art and in life, presumably referring to the Christ child. The other thing he would do very often in these Cabaret Voltaire performances were these sound poems. And he would describe these sound poems as trying to recapture a language that had been soiled by journalism, is what he blamed, journalism and advertising and so forth. And the only way to kind of reclaim the magical, mysterious meaning of language in itself is to reduce it down to unrecognizable sounds. And so he would deliver these poems that went something like Beri Beri Bimba, and they're very lyrical poems that have in them all sorts of evocative language. In one of them begins and ends with the phrase "Elomin, Elomin, lefi tolomanai," which you should hear, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani." My God, why have you forsaken me? And he performed these sound poems in what later became known as the magical bishop performance. And this is a photograph of it, of this sort of foolish bishop chanting these sound poems. And he describes the sound poems in this way. I noticed that my voice, he described this performance, I noticed that my voice had no choice but to take on the ancient cadence of priestly lamentation, that style of liturgical singing that wails in all the Catholic churches of both East and West. I began to chant my vowel sequences in a church style like a recitative, and tried not only to look serious, but to force myself to be serious. For a moment, it seemed as if there were a pale, bewildered face within my cubist mask. He was wearing a mask during the performance. A half-frightened, half-curious face of a 10-year-old boy. He's thinking of himself as a Catholic child. Trembling and hanging avidly on the priest's words in the Requiem and the high masses in his home parish. Then the lights went out, as I had ordered, and bathed in sweat, I was carried down off the stage like a magical bishop. And he later refers to praying these poems. Every night he would say the Beri Beri Bimba as a prayer. And often that's taken as a kind of, as though it's tongue-in-cheek. I don't know. You start reading Ball, and he's doing something. I think he's taking these quite seriously as prayers. And I think we do a really nice job of arguing that in the chapter on Dada and on Hugo Ball. And by the way, with respect to those chapters, they're written to be so that they can largely be taken pieces at a time and out of order. So if it turned out to be kind of a big book. So if you don't want to read the whole thing, skip around. Read what you're interested in. Read the part on Dada. It's really good. It's really good. Okay, maybe I'll stop at that point and take questions if you have any questions or comments or I don't know, ideas. So the question is, why did religion and modern art wage war? Who fired the first shot? Well, that's a hard one. I mean, in a lot of ways, it, I think, was one of those, I think it was a reciprocal thing. I mean, there was, in the 19th century, there just was an intense fragilization of belief under the pressure of Darwin. What does evolution have to do with Christianity? Does it undermine it, or is it okay? Under pressures of globalization, you're coming into contact with lots of other forms of religious thought you didn't know how to account for or deal with. I think modernization, there's something to the idea that modernization does involve a form of secularization, one that fragilizes, but one that just puts a lot of pressure on the believer, on the church. And the church responded to that, churches, I should say, responded to that and responded to a lot of the questioning that happened among scientists, philosophers, artists, as threatening to the church. And so you just set up this, I think you just have this kind of relationship that goes pretty sour pretty quickly. And is very complicated. That's a very complicated story. That's why Charles Taylor writes books that are this long. But I think with regards to the art history, the way that art history is written, is that I think that really happens, the split really happens, where the way we account for modern art drops religion out of the picture. I think that happens in the mid to late 20th century. The forms of, and this is another argument for another book, but the forms that become the dominant interpretive forms, the ways that we account for an artwork and interpret it, make sense of it, what we consider to matter about an artwork, for a variety of reasons, religious thought, theology namely, doesn't work in those critical methods. And so all the accounts of artworks are just dropping religion and theology out of the picture. Well, I'll be more specific. The ways we interpreted artworks became very suspicious. So you can't read an artwork straight. so to speak. Whatever it's doing, we have to interpret it suspiciously. What is this thing doing politically? What kind of gender codes or class codes, what sort of power is actually going on in this artwork? And so you start not addressing an artwork directly or letting it address you directly, but reading it suspiciously. It's what's called the hermeneutics of suspicion. And those just shape the primary ways that we interpret artworks in the study of 20th century art history. And it turns out that religion, it's hard for religion to survive the suspicious hermeneutic, because you boil religious content down to a power. It's about social power and social oppression and that kind of thing. And so artists who are wrestling with theological ideas, you start reading that and it just inevitably becomes critique of the church or critique of power. Does that make sense? Does that help? And that's not, and I think religious people and theologians didn't do much to help help that situation. They became defensive and wrote books like Rookmaaker wrote, which in the context of modern art, the modern art discourse, you're sort of like, you just sort of entered the conversation and ejected yourself out of it at the same time, or formed your own conversation. And that's what has happened, the kind of Christian subculture that talks about art in a different way than everyone else, which is okay, but it hasn't been as interesting, I think. So the question is for the microphones, what is the role of religious art critics or religious criticism? If criticism is the problem, so then what? How does religion come back in, or theology come back into art criticism? Is that an okay version of your question? Yeah, I think that's a gigantic issue. It's probably the main thing that I'm working on. This book is kind of prelude to that issue. I think art criticism is where the ball game happens. It's not primarily about, it's not even primarily about what the artist is thinking or what the biographical content of the artist, that he grew up in a religious home or something like that. Where the ball game is played, if I can say that, is as you stand in front of an artwork and strive to make sense of it and strive to find appropriate speech and meaning for it. That is art criticism, broadly speaking. Sometimes we say art criticism. By art criticism, we mean the really stuffy stuff, the nerdy stuff that appears in journals that no one reads. But by art criticism, I mean just trying to make sense of something, interpreting something, finding words for it. If that's art criticism, I think that's where the interest in religion and theology has to be focused. Not in writing new biographies about the artist, though that's helpful, and not in writing new theologies of art. That's okay, but that's seminary discourse. It's the discourse of art history and art interpretation where theology just has sort of no interesting functional role. And I think there's just a lot of work that needs to be done there. Yeah. I mean, if you go to most graduate schools, most undergraduate schools, and you start talking about this, people are like, you're deluded. I'm not sure what you're talking about. Like, what religion? Like, what? Why not? You might as well be talking about clowns and modern art, which that's an interesting conversation. You might get more interest in that one. No, I mean, there is a real renewed interest in religion and theology. It seems like the writing about it, though, the writing about modern and contemporary art in religious and theological terms is just kind of lame in comparison to a lot kind of mainstream art history. The best art history, it just seems like the best accounts of artworks from the last 100 years mostly ignore religion and theology as being meaningful to the interpretive process. And that's what I want to contest and try to rectify in some ways. Not by kind of waging a war or saying, take back the culture or something like that, but just to say, it leads to really interesting interpretations and is necessary for someone like Hugo Ball and someone like Malevich and so forth. You just have to deal with that stuff if you're going to do good criticism without determining what the sort of conclusion will be. If we get into trouble, we already are getting into trouble with some of our Christian friends for we're getting somewhat in trouble. People are thinking this might be a dangerous project. You're opening up theology to discussions of nihilism and so forth, and you're kind of I don't know. I'm not too worried about that. Maybe I should be. Should I be? Yeah, totally. Okay, maybe one more question, and then we can do an informal discussion. So your question is how theological art criticism opens new resources for biblical criticism and interpretation? Of Scripture. Theological art criticism of Scripture. Well, I'm really interested in that question. There has been over the last 10 years especially, the revival of theological interpretation of Scripture. One would think that would be what biblical hermeneutics has been doing, but it turns out no. that in the same way that we read artworks suspiciously, we have been reading, or the Academy has been reading Scripture very suspiciously, which is good, has been helpful. It's produced a lot of wonderful insights. But there is a kind of renewal recently, people writing books about the renewal of theological biblical criticism or theological interpretation of Scripture. And I'm really interested in that discourse. It has a lot of similarities in some ways, and I have a lot to learn from that discourse. I don't know what I have to offer that discourse, other than that my view is that Scripture does probably the majority of its theology in visual form. That might be contestable, but it does its theology through images, and I think our a good theological interpretation of Scripture has to have some visual savvy to it and some real acumen with ancient art history, especially. So I don't know how much modern and contemporary criticism will help my fellow Bible scholars, but certainly art history would. I just think if you want to read the Old Testament, for instance, you just have to know Egyptian art history and Babylonian, Mesopotamian art history. Yeah, maybe you don't have to. Matt and I argue about this, have argued about this. But I just think it's incredibly illuminating because the texts, the biblical texts, are using those images all over the place, and not where you think they are. Like I think Genesis 1 is one big image, and it is an image that is doing wild things with the Egyptian visual imagination. And Genesis 2 is doing wild things with Mesopotamian visual imagination. And it just goes on from there. So if we have anything to contribute back, it's ancient art history. Okay, thank you for coming. Bless you all. Have a good night.